Once again, we welcome you back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Mike Viola back to the show. He's a familiar voice, but Mike, as always, for the sake of those who are getting acquainted with you for the first time, take a moment to tell us just a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Brian. I'm Mike Viola. I am the Director of Analytics at the Foundation for Economic Education, where we advocate for the ideas that make a free society with young people in both the classroom and online.
Okay, I'm looking at a great article that you wrote for National Review about ESG. And I had to stop and think a second. Okay, ESG, remind me, that stands for environmental, social, and governance. Can you give us just a brief thumbnail sketch? Where does this concept come from? I know we've heard about it, but where did it originate?
Sure, it originated in the 90s is really when it became bigger as kind of a niche product. And then maybe in the last 10 years, it's become even more of a presence in the American investing markets. Basically, it's the idea that those three letters you just mentioned, environmental, social, and governance, are risk factors that should be assessed in addition to regular cash flow, that sort of thing, when making investments, and that it's a useful way to account for risk in a portfolio. Now, naturally, those are areas that are very prone to politicization, and a lot of marketing around these funds have turned into, oh, well, you're saving the world by investing, et cetera. I think it's kind of gotten out of control. So that's kind of why it's now a controversial topic. And I think it's hit a number of roadblocks in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I don't want to sound dismissive, but it does kind of have a woke feel to it from an environmental standpoint. You know, this is what the truly virtuous companies are doing, and if you're not doing this, well, you must not be so virtuous. But it's been kind of a tough year this last year. Talk to me a little bit about some of the pushback that has been taking place against ESG.
Yeah, well, over the last year and change, a number of red states have pushed back on ESG. It's started with the environmental side, where they saw a lot of, these red states blamed a lot of asset management firms, sort of like BlackRock and Vanguard, the firms that run your funds in your retirement account. It saw them as jeopardizing their fossil fuel industries, right? Coal in West Virginia, oil in Texas. And so they began to remove ESG funds from their state pension plans. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, to the extent that it leaves that choice open to private investors with stuff outside of state funds. But there were cases where they maybe overreached, or they maybe exaggerated the extent that these companies were, in their terms, supposedly boycotting fossil fuels. Oftentimes it was an awkward rhetorical line that wasn't actually borne out in their investments. But since then, I think they've stepped in a bit more controversy, and it's really, I would say, the S factor, the social world, that has ended up being the real linchpin in the fight against ESG. Oftentimes we see it as basically indistinguishable from a progressive social agenda, right? Like diversity quotas on boards, marketing to say favored groups. I think a lot of people blamed that Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light controversy a couple months ago on trying to meet ESG diversity scores. So that's really where I think the controversy has gotten, and maybe where it's gotten more salient, right? I think that it became a weird mechanism of endorsing social progressivism that really didn't stick with people in a way that maybe the average person understands the environmental risk a little more.
Just out of curiosity, how has this affected investors in the companies that have embraced ESG? I mean, it seems like there's a fiduciary duty, for the stockholders, maybe it's the shareholders. Anyway, those who handle the investments, they're supposed to be turning a profit, or at least, we're getting a return on our investment. But it sounds like some of these ESG approaches actually, well, it's not about the money, it's about something else. Can they square that with the duty to effectively represent people's investment in the company?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think in part because each of those letters, E, S, and G, the problem is there are very limited circumstances where they are in fact real risk factors, right? Like there are cases where, say, managing waste obviously could have a long-term impact if not done correctly, and so you'd want to consider environment and governance, right? Like ethics issues, et cetera. I mean, I thought that was regular investing. I don't know why that needs an acronym. I think it's kind of when it becomes indistinguishable, sort of between a progressive social agenda and investing for return, that the problem really comes, and when it's intermingled with state funds. You might have heard in some of the ESG news, nowadays people are throwing around the term pecuniary factors or non-pecuniary factors. So recently a bill introduced in the House by their representatives Andy Barr and Rick Allen. So they have a bill called the Ensuring Sound Guidance Act. The idea there is they believe that investments should only be guided by pecuniary factors, that is, those related to risk and return calculations. Now, theoretically, that wouldn't nix ESG, but it would restrict it only to areas where it actually has an impact on returns. Similar legislation has been imposed by certain states, Florida being the most notable example, which took a little more of a nuanced take on ESG than I'd say other red states. Despite Ron DeSantis' bluster, he put a lot of thought into making sure that in the legislation they're actually targeting ESG when it is political, not when it isn't political and is only, affects your investments positively. So that's kind of where this awkward balance is, right? We kind of want to make sure that in cases where state funds are involved or where people are being defaulted to options in their employer's retirement plan, that it is risk and return that is driving their investments and not politics.
Talk to me about Blackwater CEO Larry Fink, because I understand his name gets drawn into this quite a bit. What did he mean when he talked about being ashamed for being part of the political discussion?
Yeah, so this is BlackRock, not Blackwater. This is not the this is not the security guy, but for Dick Cheney land. But no, this is BlackRock. That's the biggest asset manager in the United States. I'm sure they're probably behind some of the funds in listeners' retirement accounts. He has been a big proponent of ESG for years now, particularly on the climate side. He sees climate as a big investment risk. But about a month ago, I would say after about a solid year of being dragged through the mud over ESG stuff, he said he was ashamed of having been drawn into this political debate. He's no longer going to use the term ESG because he says both sides have misused it, and he wants to get it back to limited risk return calculations. It's hard to disagree with those statements. I think it just feels a little insincere at this point that now he's sort of embarrassed by the beast he had a big part in creating by a lot of his inflamed climate and anti-fossil fuel rhetoric, even though, again, BlackRock continued to invest in fossil fuels, no problem. But I think he unfortunately alienated sort of both sides. He alienated both people on the right who don't want politics in their investments, and he alienated people on the left who thought he was a true climate crusader, and he turned out not to be. So I think his backing off of ESG, it's a welcome sign. I'm sure we'll see similar things packaged in other ways. He threw around the term conscientious capitalism, which, of course, sounds sketchy, but we'll wait for that to play out. But I take his walk back as just a sign that ESG did not play out how they thought it would. People are legitimately skeptical of it. They should be skeptical of it. They shouldn't jump to the conclusion that there are never environmental or governance concerns. But when it gets political, when you can't rationalize it on a risk-return basis, that's when you got to be worried. And I'm glad we're backing off from ESG.
Okay, fascinating article, and I'm only sorry we didn't have time to talk about, and do we worry about what comes next? Maybe we can do that in a future interview. Again, we're talking with Mike Viola. He's the head of analytics at the Foundation for Economic Education and also a Young Voices contributor. Mike, where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at MF_Viola, or Twitter X, whatever it's now called. I hear the names changing. You can also find my work at young-voices.com, where I'm listed on their contributors page.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Miranda Spindt back to the program. Miranda, this is going to be a first time for some people meeting you, so let's take just a moment here and just kind of tell them who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name is Miranda Spindt. I'm a contributor with Young Voices. I'm continuing now with the writing program for the rest of the year, which is very exciting. I'm happy to keep doing this. I'm also a policy associate at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, doing policy research focused mostly on education and healthcare, but a lot of topics. And then I'm also a student getting my master's in public administration currently.
And what do you do in your spare time? I'm sorry, you don't have any spare time, right? you got a pretty full plate.
I live in the gorgeous Lake Country area in Wisconsin, so lots of kayaking, boating, and stuff like that is probably my favorite thing to do, especially now in the summer that it's nice around here.
Nice. Now, I'm very grateful that you have a focus on educational policy because you have what to me was surprisingly good news about school choice. I've been watching this very closely in my home state of Idaho. This was you would think it would be a slam dunk issue, and it's not. It's very bitterly contested for some reason. But I see that school choice is actually gaining ground in some unlikely places. Wisconsin being one of those places, and I guess it's kind of a strange story in the sense that there's a divided government there, but that didn't stop school choice from happening. Tell us about how that came about.
Yeah, so we have a divided government here with Republican-controlled legislature and Democratic governor. And our Democratic governor, he used to be the superintendent for the Department of Public Administration here, and he's had a long history of being opposed to school choice. So what happened is we're in our budget session, or we just finished our budget session over the spring, and there was a very large bill that needed to happen for shared revenue, to increase shared revenue to our local counties, municipalities, and a large portion of that was making sure that we could increase funding for Milwaukee and Milwaukee County, which is facing bankruptcy. So we wanted to I guess Republican legislators, they kind of capitalized on that a bit and negotiated, saying that if you want to get certain things that you want in this bill for shared revenue for Milwaukee, such as increasing the sales tax and making sure that there didn't have to be a referendum for voters to approve the increase in the sales tax, that in order to do that they use that negotiating chip to encourage an increase in funding, per pupil funding for private schools and independent charter schools here in the state. So both of those bills got passed already, signed by Governor Evers, and that was a very big win for us considering the barrier that we have in our governor.
I have to say I'm impressed, just because in the other states that I've watched where this has been an issue and still is an issue, it seems like sometimes the sides are so entrenched, and I mean both sides are dug in deep. Was it pragmatism that carried the day here, where each side got a little bit of what they wanted and maybe had to give up a little bit of something?
Yes, definitely. So like I said, Republicans, as far as the shared revenue bill went, they were really adamant on having a referendum so that Milwaukee County and city voters could decide if they wanted their sales tax to increase. Eventually they gave in, and it turned out to just be a 2/3 vote or majority vote of the county board, which passed, and already the sales tax has been implemented here in the county, and same thing in the city. So there was that. Also, Republicans gave up a little bit in the school choice bill. There wasn't as much of an increase in funding as they wanted, and there was also not that it was something the Republicans didn't want, but another thing they gave to Governor Evers in that bill was a $1 billion increase in public schools, in addition to increasing the school choice voucher fund per pupil funding. So there was definitely a give and take, and people compromising on both sides. So a little bit of win some, lose some for both sides, definitely.
Now, before we went on the air, you and I were talking about how, you would think in some states where there's much more of a red state feel, more of a conservative bent, that it should be easy to pass. But sometimes there's an urban and rural divide that gets in the way. Can you kind of walk us through how that presents a challenge in those states?
Sure. So my piece is definitely focused on divided governments, and I give a few examples in the article of Republican-controlled unified governments, where school choice has been it's really had a great year overall around the country in many different states, but mostly in unified governments. But even in unified government, that isn't necessarily a silver bullet to having school choice passed. So both Georgia and Texas had legislation fail this year. And a lot of that is because of the urban-rural divide. So in rural counties, there's typically only 1 or 2 public schools in an area. And obviously, if a student were to pick a choice school, the funding would follow that student, which makes sense in a lot of places. But that can feel very threatening for the public schools in those smaller areas where people are very reliant on those public schools, and that creates quite a divide. So, like I said, being a Republican state isn't a silver bullet for passing school choice, but yes.
Okay, so I have to ask this question carefully because I understand compromise is a part of politics at pretty much every level. But has anybody approached school choice with an all or nothing approach and actually gotten what they wanted, or is that pretty much non-existent rather?
I mean, I don't know if it's non-existent, but as far as I'm aware, it seems like school choice has definitely been a incremental progress. I mean, Milwaukee, I think, was some of the first school choice programs in the country almost 30 years ago. And, we're still having these battles, and Wisconsin, I think now with this increase in per pupil funding, we're 7th in the nation for closing the gap between funding for choice schools and public schools. So there's definitely, I think, probably more of an incremental, slow progress battle for school choice.
So are there any other states that you're watching or keeping an eye on that are very close to getting school choice, or that have reached kind of the same state that Wisconsin was in? I'm just curious, what are the other states we should watch for to see whether they're able to strike some kind of a deal?
I don't know about other states being able to strike a deal. One state that I am watching is North Carolina. They have a divided government with the Democratic governor. What's interesting in their case is that they have a Republican supermajority that can override a governor's veto. So there is some school choice legislation moving there, and I'm curious to see how that will play out if the governor signs it or just vetoes it and then it gets passed anyway.
Here in my home state of Idaho, it was actually Republicans who switched votes or who said, nope, I'm not going to get behind, a school choice bill. Or I think it was education savings accounts. And I was kind of surprised. I expected from the opposition, but it turns out that there were Republicans who had reservations. And do you see this in other states as well? Are there Republicans who stand in the way of school choice?
Definitely. Even here in Wisconsin, we had a few Republican legislators who we had to really convince to vote for this school choice legislation. And I mentioned earlier Texas and Georgia, where that legislation failed despite having a unified government. So, yeah, especially with those rural counties and districts where people represent Republicans can also be a barrier.
Okay, and one other question here. We're down to about a minute left. Miranda, Where does it go once they have a degree of school choice? Does that mean that the issue is settled, or are people still pushing? There's more that we want to see. We want to see, a separation of school and state, or we want to see, more competition. Does it lead somewhere from there, or is it just, getting to some degree of school choice and that's good enough?
I think the goal for many people in the school choice movement is universal school choice. The idea that there should be absolutely no limits depending on where you're from, what zip code you live in. You should be able to go to any school that works best for you, whether that's public or private or a charter school. And I think that's the ultimate goal that we should be shooting for as far as school choice goes.
Okay. Again, we are talking with Miranda Spindt, and she is with Young Voices as well as a policy associate at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Where can people follow you on social media, Miranda?
You can find me on Twitter at Miranda-Spindt.
Okay, very good. Well, hey, I'm hoping we get a chance to catch up again here sometime soon and have some more success stories about school choice to discuss.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me back on, Brian.
And thank you. And we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome Cassandra Shand back to the program. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, also a Young Voices Innovation Fellow. And Cassandra, tell us just a little bit about yourself for the sake of those who are meeting you for the very first time.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Brian, so much for having me on. As you said, yes, my name is Cassandra Shand. I am a current PhD candidate. I'm very involved in the startup space, have previously worked in the think tank space as well. Definitely a little bit of a space junkie. I spend most of my time on strategy stuff. So, and I love foreign policy. So, big nerd.
Well,
that's about it.
As it turns out, I'm looking at an article you wrote for nationalinterest.org. The low Earth orbiting satellite race needs more than a first place victor. And I never used to spend that much time looking up at the sky at night. I do now. And it's because the chances of seeing a satellite coming over are very, very good. I didn't realize that there was a low Earth orbiting satellite race, however. Help me understand what's going on and when did that start?
Well, since the U.S. and other countries have been involved in the space race back in the Cold War, we've known about low Earth orbiting satellites, and we've been involved in kind of seeing those satellites developed, whether that be by the government or by the commercial sector. Essentially, low Earth orbit, or the low Earth orbit, that's where low Earth orbiting satellites are situated. They're about 1,200 miles from the Earth's surface. So in that kind of below that, that's low Earth orbit. Above that, you have middle Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit. Geosynchronous is where you get GPS. But it's actually kind of crazy if you kind of think about it. Low Earth orbit is kind of the first layer of the main satellite orbital paths that satellites will take, but that creates kind of a choke point. So if you can imagine kind of it becoming increasingly congested, whoever controls that lower Earth orbit will kind of control what can leave Earth, essentially. And right now, the U.S. is very much ahead, which has created kind of a security dilemma and a security crisis for other countries, where U.S. companies are definitely dominating low Earth orbit, and other countries are feeling increasingly insecure about their prospects of gaining a significant stake in low Earth orbit.
Now, you use an analogy that made a whole lot of sense to me, and that's kind of like a parking lot. And, when you have so many objects up there in space that are competing for space, there comes a point where there's too many. Who makes the call as to whether there is sufficient space to accommodate more satellites or not?
That's the thing. So geosynchronous orbit, again, that's like GPS. There is a International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. They control those orbital allocations. And so if you want to put another position, navigation, and timing device in geosynchronous orbit, like another GPS satellite, you have to get a specific orbital slot from the ITU. That kind of governance regime does not exist around the low Earth orbiting space. There's some estimates out there that by 2030, 99% of satellites in low Earth orbit will be placed in the Earth orbit without like any kind of regulating body giving them that spot, if that makes sense. Again, like governance is a slippery slope. Like, what do you mean by governance? But for the most part, the way it would happen, at least in the US, is if you want to issue or put a satellite into space in low Earth orbit, you go through the FCC. And the FCC then kind of like gives a vague, okay, we want a satellite spot in this place to the ITU. And there's very little, if you look at the international telecommunications documents around like, say, like a Starlink slot, there's not a very big indication as to kind of how big the constellation they're planning is. So depending on the company, it's very hard to assess. And yeah, back to that analogy you mentioned before, the parking spot kind of analogy. I'd say it's more like a parking garage because it's easy to think of like all of these satellites are just one plane, but in reality, they're kind of stacked in vertical as well. So you have like horizontal placement and you have vertical placement, and it becomes really complicated because these satellites they're not in a perfectly circular orbit. And so, yeah, it's not an easy issue, but without these kind of more refined orbital allocations, we can kind of get into a messy situation.
So I'm a big fan of Starlink. In fact, that's one of the best things that's ever happened to me. I live in a rural area, and getting Starlink satellite internet was just, wow, this opens up so many possibilities. Who is competing with Starlink? I know I think hundreds, maybe there are thousands of Starlink satellites up there right now. Who are the primary competitors?
Yeah, well, it depends on like what you view as competition. In the U.S. broadband speed, so like high-speed internet, you also have like terrestrial telecommunications companies that are competing with like your market share. So we saw a few months ago with Biden's new broadband policy, that definitely favors your terrestrial like legacy telecommunications providers. In space, so like other low Earth orbiting satellite companies, you also have companies like Amazon's Project Kuiper. You have abroad, you have China. China has StarNet. You have Viasat, which is kind of an older, it has more of a legacy in the telecommunication space than Starlink does. And you also have like kind of the defense utility as well. So Starlink does provide some augmentation for the Air Force and other DoD affiliates. You have like your traditional like Lockheed types that are competing in that space as well, Hughes. So it's a very competitive landscape, but it's a growth. It's like, I think it's like a 20% CAGR. There's a reason there's a lot of market entrants. And again, like whoever controls that low Earth orbiting space controls who escapes Earth. And also, yeah, I personally, as someone who's very pro kind of like space-based internet, I really wish the US would favor more space-based telecommunications as opposed to this kind of your legacy telecommunications providers.
You know, the stuff that's going on over our heads that we are just completely oblivious to. You've kind of pulled the curtain back, and I have to admit, it kind of blows my mind a little bit. I never stop to realize just how much activity is taking place there. What kind of cooperation is there between nations? It seems like that could be a friction point. I'm thinking China in particular. They kind of do their own thing. Do the countries play well together, or is this a place where there's growing tension and maybe even potential conflict?
This is definitely a point of potential conflict. This is not about China, but think about Ukraine. I firmly believe that Starlink has set the battle space for Ukraine. Depending on who you ask, there's been stories I've heard where Ukraine could have advanced further into Russian territory, but Starlink was like, nope, we won't give you any service there. Like, we don't want to become that political. So if you go further, you won't have access. And so in many ways, you can Starlink is definitely setting the battle space. And that makes kind of SpaceX an almost supranational governance system or an extra arm of the U.S. government, like an unofficial arm. Again, there's a lot of strategic ambiguity there. And then, China definitely feels insecure. Imagine breaking the Great Firewall. It's Great Firewall. Imagine if Chinese citizens had access to the internet that Americans have access to with Starlink. That poses a direct threat to its sovereignty. They definitely are trying to catch up. But right now, SpaceX and other American companies have created a significant they have a lot of catching up to do, put it that way.
So are there solutions on the horizon as far as can the bandwidth, can the available space or capacity, can it be expanded, or is there a hard limit that people are just going to have to learn to work within?
It is finite. If you have too many space objects in low Earth orbit, think about space debris. It creates a huge space debris issue. A small little screw can wreck how many different satellites. Then there becomes a whole geopolitical concern over who's responsible for space debris. That's just a debris issue. Now imagine if that entire orbital span band is completely occupied. There's a lot of kind of moving parts. Okay, who moves when to do X, Y, and Z, so we can get something out to middle Earth orbit or beyond that. It becomes increasingly difficult. And also, I'm not sure if you and the rest of the country have seen Oppenheimer. I think it's a good example of there's definitely a strategic desire to maintain control. And right now it's as many as you shoot up there, and kind of secure your stake on a slot. It's kind of I first, when I was looking at this article, I was like, well, maybe I'll do a gold miner's analogy, where it's it's truly whoever stakes their claim first. And that's why I think there's a deep interest in making sure it's not a race to the bottom. That being said, it's in every country's strategic interest to assert a claim first, and a very big claim.
This sounds like something we all need to kind of keep one eye on, just to be aware of what's happening. And I don't want to sound morbid, but it sounds like that could actually be a battlefield at some point if, someone decides we need this space and, we need to just take it by domination.
Oh, absolutely. China tested anti-satellite weaponry in 2007. Also, as far as internet connectivity, low Earth orbiting satellites are definitely used to kind of augment PNT, so kind of reduce reliance on GPS. We rely on space-based assets for internet, for connectivity, which means connectivity to military assets as well on the ground. Meaning, if you do spoofing, jamming, anti-satellite, connect kill type stuff with anti-satellite weaponry.
I got to stop you here because we are up against the clock. But Cassandra, this is fascinating, and I want to talk with you again. So I hope we get you back on the show soon. Thanks again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today. Happy to welcome Nicholas Thielman, who joins us now as a Young Voices contributor. And Nicholas, I understand you are working with the Cato Institute. Actually, take a moment here and just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I work for, like you just mentioned, the Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives over at the Cato Institute. I'm currently a graduate student at George Mason, pursuing my master's in political science. And I'm originally from the Cleveland area. So it's a little bit about me.
Okay, we've got a very timely topic, and yet I wonder if this is going to be kind of an uncomfortable topic for some people, in that when we talk about banks and we talk about people's money, nobody wants to consider the prospect that there might be some financial instability out there, or that there could be more financial instability than we've seen. But for instance, when Silicon Valley Bank failed, just how long ago was that? It seems like a while back, but it was within recent memory.
Yeah, that was back in March when it failed. And primarily what seemed to have been the cause of it was that it didn't hedge properly against interest rate risk. So a lot of its assets suddenly lost a lot of value when the Fed started raising rates back in March.
And, of course, this raised concerns on the part of people who had deposits. And as I understand, government officials stepped up and said, well, not to worry. We're going to actually, I guess the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation released a set of recommendations that they would be willing to do unlimited deposit guarantees. And I think that would probably bring some peace of mind to some depositors, but you study economics, and I understand there's really no such thing as a free lunch. Why would that be a bad idea, to offer those kinds of guarantees?
Yeah, so it's very counterintuitive. What unlimited deposit insurance guarantee from the FDIC would end up doing is essentially wiping away the last bit of market discipline that banks have to deal with in this sort of in governing their risk taking behavior, essentially by guaranteeing deposits above $250,000, you would essentially remove the sort of last remaining incentives that these uninsured depositors have to actually monitor the risk taking on the part of bank insiders or bank management, and to essentially remove that last kind of barrier against the sort of risk taking, the sort of reckless lending or poor risk management that ended up leading to the collapse of SVB and then the Signature Bank as well.
So it would create a safety net of sorts, rather, that might actually encourage more reckless behavior.
Yeah. So the problem is when it comes to deposit insurance guarantees is that it creates this issue of moral hazard, where depositors and shareholders, because they're not facing the full value of their risk-taking behavior, do not fully account for the risk-taking on the part of bank managers because they're not experiencing the full cost of it. So they will tend to not demand as high equity capital levels to sort of provide cushion against losses. They will not demand higher deposit rates on the deposits they supply to the banks. And this inevitably kind of leads to banks essentially taking on too much risk, engaging in far more riskier lending practices than they otherwise would, which creates increases the amount of risk actually building up in the bank system, which leads to these sort of periodic panics that we see, such as with SVB and Signature Bank. As
you point out in your article, it's not like the FDIC is some new creation and we just rolled this out and this is to promote stability. We actually have a pretty long history. I mean, we're talking 90 years that we can look back and observe how has it performed, what has it done to mitigate these risks, what can we learn from nearly a century of that Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation being in existence.
Oh, absolutely. Like the FDIC has been around since 1933 when it was created during the Great Depression. In that time, we have seen studies that have come out that have shown that deposit insurance guarantees, like the one that they would be proposing to increase for the uninsured depositors, have led to risky behavior and have contributed to everything from the S&L crisis in the 1980s to the great financial crisis that occurred a few years ago. For the S&L crisis, it seemed to have been that by raising the deposit guarantee from $40,000 to about $100,000, it forestalled a lot of S&Ls, a lot of thrifts that were otherwise insolvent from having to essentially properly take account of their risk taking. And then on top of that, we have more evidence of these sort of things, this sort of guarantee contributing to the great financial crisis in 2008. And then even before the creation of the FDIC, we have examples at the state level of sort of historic deposit guarantees that led to, again, the same sort of overextension by banks, overexpansion and risk-taking, which led to these sort of periodic collapses of local bank systems within states like Oklahoma, Texas, New York. But what we end up seeing is that there were a handful of these banking systems that essentially operated through a system more mutual accounts, mutual monitoring and insurance, by essentially making sure that every bank in the system was going to be liable for the costs that were essentially imposed upon the system as a whole, all of the banks, by the particular risk-taking behavior of certain banks that incentivized the sort of mutual monitoring and constraint that prevented some degree of risk-taking and allowed for a greater degree of stability. This mostly being illustrated in places like Ohio and Iowa and New York.
What is the alternative then? I know that, some people will hit the panic button. Well, what are we saying then? We just let these banks fail? Can a case be made that sometimes that is the proper course of action?
Yeah. I mean, if a bank has taken on too much risk, if its liabilities outweigh its assets, this is inherently an unsound institution. And there have not been these sort of systemic-wide panics that a lot of people use as the primary argument for government deposit insurance. Really, when you look at the history of banking panics, it's mostly been movements from unsound institutions to sound institutions. This includes things like the Great Depression, which was initially kind of the impetus behind creating the FDIC. In terms of kind of alternatives, there is a case to be made, however small, that at least for small deposit holders, for small savers, for unsophisticated savers, there is a rationale for providing them some sort of minimum guarantee. But for those who are above a certain income threshold, I'm not sure what that should be, but these people have the sophistication, or they have the means to essentially purchase the sophistication needed to properly manage their savings, properly manage their assets. And broadly speaking, I would say the alternative would be kind of a stepping down of the level of deposit insurance that returns the incentives to savers, to deposit holders, to properly manage their assets, to properly monitor bank management. And this would, as we've seen historically, increase the level of stability in the financial system.
The concerns over bank runs, I think, that's a pretty scary thing, and I think that can snowball. Are there alternatives to deeper regulation? Are there reforms that could be undertaken, short of offering unlimited loan or unlimited deposit guarantees, that could also address or mitigate that particular risk?
I would say, at a minimum, not doing any more damage would probably be the best sort of near-term solution. So not raising the level of deposit guarantees. It's sort of like a longer-term solution. I would say you could probably take a scaling down of the overall level of guarantees gradually over time. That would allow banks to essentially adapt their portfolios to the loss of this guarantee, so that you kind of get this reallocation of capital towards a more sounder institutions. And then you get essentially these insolvent institutions. Those would eventually go by the wayside. But broadly speaking, I would say the best approach would be to gradually move away from a state-based or government-supplied deposit insurance guarantee. Again, maybe there's a case for that sort of minimum guarantee, but I would generally say moving away or further away from government guarantees would probably be the best way to sort of forestall systemic risk of that nature.
Well, it sounds like this makes a pretty powerful case for why market forces should be allowed to operate. And
Exactly.
the fact that, some banks and some businesses will fail, that should be a consequence of bad decision making or risky decision making. But we're very risk averse, of course. We're very failure averse. And it sounds like by adding government into the mix, no, we'll prop you up. It just seems to make things worse somehow in the process.
Yeah, government definitely tends to be more of a source of instability, or systemic risk, if you will, than it tends to be the solution to that instability or systemic risk.
All right. Again, we're talking with Nicholas Thielman. He is a contributor at Young Voices as well as a graduate student at George Mason University. Nicholas, for those who want to follow you on social media or otherwise follow your writing, where can they find you?
I am on, like I said, I have a page over at the CMFA's website where you can see some of the posts I've had there. I can be followed at NA Thielman on Twitter. And then I am also on LinkedIn. Just search me.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.